Live TV wasn't ready for what happened next. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, with nothing to lose, brought out a hidden investigation, and Melania Trump couldn't hide behind silence this time. It was supposed to be just another political segment, 4 guests, 1 moderator, and a primetime audience expecting more of the same. People tuning in from living rooms across America had no idea they were about to witness one of the most jaw-dropping moments in recent memory. The set was standard, dark blue backlit panels, high chairs, and coffee mugs nobody actually drank from. Seated third from the left, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett looked calm, almost reserved, in a tailored navy blazer. Her expression didn't change much during the first 20 minutes. She listened, made notes, and said little. But when the host pivoted the conversation toward ethics in politics, something shifted. The camera cut to Melania Trump, seated across from Jasmine. Elegant and poised, she was doing what she'd done countless times before, sidestepping tough questions with practiced charm. The audience didn't blink, they'd seen this routine. But Jasmine leaned forward, not too far, just enough to send a silent message, "I'm ready." "Well," Jasmine said, her voice smooth but firm, "since we're talking about ethics, let's stop pretending some people get a free pass just because of who they married." The panel went quiet. The host blinked. Melania tilted her head slightly. "I'm sorry, was that directed at me?" she asked. Jasmine didn't flinch. She reached into her bag, not frantically, not dramatically, and pulled out a neatly stacked folder. She placed it on the table, slid off the clip, and began laying out photocopied records one after another. "These are transaction logs, offshore account filings, and a report from an abandoned investigation in upstate New York," Jasmine said calmly. "All tied to shell companies used in the late 2000s. And every single one has a connection to your name." You could hear a pin drop. Melania's eyes flicked down at the documents. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked at the host. "That's absurd," she finally said, with a nervous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This is clearly an attack. I won't engage in conspiracy theories." "It's not a theory if it's backed by court records and banking logs," Jasmine replied. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't have to. Behind the cameras, producers were scrambling. Someone in the control booth was signaling frantically. An assistant handed a note to the host, but the damage was already done. Clips of the exchange were being recorded and shared live on social media. Within minutes, hashtags like #Crockett vs Melania and #Jasmine has receipts began trending. Melania tried to pivot. "We're here to talk about America's future, not dig up ancient nonsense from foreign countries," she said. Jasmine interrupted gently. "With all due respect, when your past raises questions about money laundering and influence, it is America's future." The moderator, finally regaining his voice, tried to steer the conversation away. "Let's stay on topic, please." "I am on topic," Jasmine said, not looking away. "The topic is accountability." People watching at home were glued to their screens. No one had ever confronted Melania like that, especially not on live national television, not with facts, not with documentation, not with the kind of confidence that says, "I know what I'm doing, and I know what I'm risking." And just like that, the story slipped out of the studio's control. 3 days before the roundtable, Jasmine sat across from her chief of staff, Kenny Rose, in a quiet corner booth at a diner just outside Fort Worth, the kind of place where waitresses still called you, "hun," and refilled your coffee without asking. Jasmine wasn't hungry. She had a folder in front of her, not the same one she'd carry onto live television, but close. "This isn't just political," Kenny said, leaning in, voice low. "You're talking about Melania Trump. They're going to come after you hard." Jasmine stirred her coffee but didn't drink it. "Let them," she said quietly. "People need to stop pretending she was just an accessory in all of this. There's paperwork, Kenny. There's proof." Kenny sighed and glanced toward the window. "Proof doesn't always win. Sometimes it just gets you buried." She didn't answer right away. Jasmine had spent most of her adult life walking into rooms where she wasn't expected to talk, let alone lead. A black woman from the south side of Dallas with no family money, no legacy name, just grit and receipts. She'd fought her way through law school, spent years as a public defender, and eventually made it to Congress on the backs of grassroots supporters who believed in her fire. Not everyone in Washington respected her, but they feared how sharp she was when she spoke. "I'm not trying to start a fire," she finally said. "I'm trying to show people it's already burning." Back at her apartment that night, she went through every page again, reports from an abandoned fraud case in Syracuse that no one ever followed up on, signatures from Melania's alleged European ventures with misspelled names and mismatched dates, financial documents showing wire transfers to shell companies in the British Virgin Islands dated just a year before Donald Trump began his campaign. She didn't have the whole picture, but she had enough corners to make out what had once been hidden. Still, there was a weight to it, not just the threat of lawsuits or political blowback, but a personal gamble. She wasn't just going after a former First Lady, she was taking on the machinery that had kept powerful people protected for decades. Her phone buzzed. A message from a friend at an independent outlet in Pittsburgh read, "Are you seriously going through with this? They'll twist it. They'll say you're angry, unstable." Jasmine stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "They always say that until they can't." The next morning, she reached out to a retired federal clerk named Dolores Finney, who'd quietly shared the Syracuse case files with her years earlier. Dolores, now in her late 70s and mostly off the grid, was still sharp. "You sure you're ready to go public?" Dolores asked, her voice calm and raspy through the speakerphone. "They've buried too much," Jasmine said. "You and I both know this woman's past didn't just disappear. It was erased on purpose." Dolores paused, then, with a dry laugh, said, "You've got bigger balls than half the people I worked with at the DOJ." Jasmine smiled, but the weight never left her chest. Courage always came with a clock ticking somewhere in the distance. By the time she walked into the studio on the day of the show, the folder felt heavier than it should have, not physically, but emotionally. She knew she wouldn't get a second shot at this. Either she said it clearly the first time, or the moment would slip through the cracks of manufactured outrage and PR spin. 10 minutes before airtime, she stood in front of a hallway mirror, having a conversation with herself. "Be surgical. Be steady. Don't yell. Let the facts do the shouting." Then she whispered the same 3 words she always said before walking into something that scared her: "Tell the truth." She walked past the stage manager, past the flashing red countdown light, past the fake smiles from guests who thought today was just business as usual. When she sat down and looked across the table at Melania Trump, she didn't see a former First Lady. She saw someone protected by silence. And Jasmine had already decided she wasn't going to be part of that silence anymore. To understand what Jasmine knew, we have to go back further into the details Melania spent years trying to keep buried. Long before she was a household name, Melania was just Melania Naus from Sevnica, Slovenia. According to the glossy profiles and rehearsed interviews, her rise from a modest Eastern European town to First Lady was nothing short of a fairy tale. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't interested in fairy tales. She wanted to know what had been left out of the story. One of her interns, a sharp 24-year-old named Troy Whitman, had been the first to flag inconsistencies in Melania's early modeling and business records. They'd been combing through archived registries from Europe and found 3 separate companies tied to her name, none of which were ever disclosed during her husband's campaign. She signed off on a patent application in Zurich in '98, Troy told Jasmine one afternoon as they sat in a cramped Capitol Hill office. Problem is, she claimed in interviews that she was already in the US full-time by then. Jasmine leaned over the documents. "What kind of patent?" "Jewelry designs." Very vague, but the paper trail doesn't go cold until 2003, which means she had ongoing business ties overseas long after she claimed she didn't. It might have sounded harmless, jewelry designs, old paperwork. But Jasmine had practiced law long enough to know what offshore accounts were often used for, especially when the transactions didn't match the timelines presented to the public. Then came the Pennsylvania connection. A closed lawsuit had been filed in 2006 in Allegheny County under the name Mess Holdings. At first glance, it looked like a routine real estate dispute, but tucked in the appendix was a sealed affidavit alleging wire fraud with signatures redacted. The judge, now retired, had sealed the file under national interest. No one looked deeper. No one wanted to. Troy looked up from his laptop. She's got too many names attached to too many small, shady businesses. Either she was laundering money, or she's the unluckiest entrepreneur on earth. That comment stuck with Jasmine for days. She began building a timeline, 1996 to 2006, modeling gigs, green card inconsistencies, a boutique fashion line registered under a cousin's name in New Mexico, a short-lived consulting company in Miami with 0 employees and 1 massive loan. It wasn't just suspicious, it was structured. Jasmine reached out to a contact in Harrisburg, someone who used to work in the state's financial crimes unit. He agreed to talk under the condition that his name never appeared in anything official. "You want my opinion," he said after skimming through the files Jasmine sent over. It was a cover operation, shells to pull money through. Nothing big enough to make headlines, but just enough to keep people quiet. And the federal agencies? Either they weren't looking, or someone told them not to. That's what burned the most, not the alleged crimes themselves, but how quickly silence moved in when the names got powerful. Melania had spent years shaping her image, always the elegant observer, never quite in the room when decisions were made. The world saw her as distant but harmless. Jasmine saw it differently. The distance wasn't detachment, it was protection. The more she dug, the clearer it became that Melania hadn't just benefited from privilege. She had learned how to disappear behind it. There was one moment Jasmine kept coming back to, a charity gala in Dallas in 2012. Jasmine had been invited as a guest of a local firm. Melania had flown in for a brief appearance. She spoke for 12 minutes, didn't answer questions, and left through the back hallway with 2 men who weren't listed as part of her staff. Jasmine remembered because it was the first time she noticed how guarded Melania was, even in a friendly room. "She's not untouchable," Jasmine told Kenny one late night in the office. "She just walks like no one's allowed to ask questions." Kenny looked exhausted. "Yeah, but if you're going to ask, make sure you have the kind of answers no one can spin." Jasmine held up her growing stack of folders. "That's exactly what I'm building." Once she had enough, she stopped talking about it. She didn't tease it to the press or leak pieces to pundits. She waited, watched, and picked her moment. When the live roundtable came knocking, she knew. This wasn't about scoring political points, it was about asking the question too many people had ignored: why has this woman's past always been treated as off-limits? But what made it even more complicated was the case that never made it to court, the one that vanished just as it was heating up. The case file had no title on the cover, just a date, June 17, 2011. Location, Syracuse, New York. It was thin, about 12 pages long, but every sentence carried weight. Jasmine had gotten it through a retired paralegal named Rodney Clean, who'd once worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of New York. He still had copies of old files the system had misplaced. This one, Rodney said, sliding the file across his kitchen table, wasn't supposed to vanish, but someone made it disappear. Inside was a memo referencing a woman named McNouse, a known alias of Melania before she changed the spelling of her name in official U.S. documents. The memo outlined a federal inquiry into a suspected financial funneling scheme involving small real estate purchases, sudden resales, and offshore payments that didn't match tax records. The key witness was a Slovenian-born accountant named Lydia Key, who had quietly been cooperating with the IRS at the time. She'd been living in Buffalo under a temporary visa, working through an amnesty program for whistleblowers. But her cooperation came at a price. She vanished. 2 weeks after this memo, she stopped showing up to check-ins, Rodney said. Never picked up her last stipend. Apartment cleared out overnight. Jasmine flipped through the pages. Any chance she went home? Rodney shook his head. Passports were flagged. No flight records, nothing. At the time, the case was labeled inactive. Eventually, it was closed under insufficient supporting testimony. In short, without Lydia, the case died quietly, no headlines, no accountability. Jasmine sat with that for a long time. She contacted an old friend at the Syracuse Herald, a local reporter named Chelsea Morano, who had covered the story briefly when it first emerged. Back then, no one knew the full scope, and few people cared. I remember that, Chelsea told her over the phone. We tried to follow up, but the federal office stonewalled us. Then 2 of our editors got pulled into private meetings, and the story just vanished. Did you ever hear Melania's name in connection to it? Jasmine asked. Chelsea hesitated. Never on record, but there were whispers. Back then, we thought it was crazelatier.